Hello and welcome back everyone to your final lesson of Module 2 in Python programming. The focus of today's lesson is to conclude our SQLite database development work, and throughout this lesson we're going to learn how to retrieve and manipulate our data. Now, as we've just mentioned, the objectives for today's lesson is fairly straightforward and simple. First, we're going to learn how to retrieve our data from our SQL database using the select statement, and then we'll move on to updating our existing data using the update statement. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into our practical demonstration and let's get cracking. Now, before we get started with the source code for today's lesson, let's quickly have a recap on what we've achieved in the previous lesson. In our previous lesson, we learned how to insert all the records into our database. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to erase all of this code over here, and I'm going to start from scratch. I'll maintain the import statement because I still need to import the SQLite database. Do keep in mind that we are working from the Python source code live lesson 6 file. And the reason for this is because we want to maintain our source code exactly where our database is located within the lesson 6 directory. So instead of creating a brand new script from scratch, I'm simply going to continue within the script that we worked on previously. Great, so let's get started. We'll start off with our source code by selecting the data from our database. Remember, from the previous lesson, we managed to simply review our data within a tool called DB Browser for SQLite. In today's lesson, we're going to try and achieve the exact same thing, but within our IDE. So the first requirement is to create a connection to my database. So I'll create a variable called con, set this equal to SQLite3.connect. And now I need to specify my database name. And as we know, this is employee underscore database.db. The next line requires me to just simply print out a success message. So I'll simply print out opened database successfully. Wonderful. So the next step is to create a variable that we can use to connect to our database and query by calling the execute method. And what we're going to pass through this method is a select statement. So right below this, I'll create a variable called cursor. I'll set this equal to the connection that we created, and then I'll call the .execute method on this. And what we'll pass through here is a select statement. So I'm simply going to say select the employee ID, the name, the department name, the region, and I believe salary was the final field. And I'll select this from the employees table. Great. So now we need to output the data that we're going to pass through this variable called cursor. Also note that in Python, we have an object called a cursor, and all a cursor allows us to do is connect to a SQL database, retrieve a bunch of records, and the idea then is to iterate through those records so we can print each one of them out. On a new line over here, I'm going to call a for loop. And the idea behind this is to iterate through our cursor so we can get the payload from the cursor into our variable called row. So I'll say for row in the cursor that we just created. We also want to add a colon, and remember, indentation is key. I'll print out the employee ID first, and then I'll add an equal over here with a bit of spacing. Remember, this is just going to be a string that we are going to be printing out, and I'll concatenate this. You might not have seen this before, but this is just another way of concatenating a variable with a string. I'm going to concatenate the row at the 0 index, and here we want to use square braces. And then I'll simply copy and paste this a couple of times, and I'll alter the values that we're retrieving. So the next one would be the name over here. We also want the department name, and likewise we want the region, and finally we want to retrieve the salary. So before we execute this code, let's just clean up a couple of things. Apart from the 0 index, we want to increase the indexes here as well, because the name will be located at row 1. Likewise, we'll have the department at 2, 3 for the region, and 4 for the salary. And what we can also do, just to keep things a little more neat and clean, we can make sure that we are iterating over a new line. So what exactly is happening here before we actually run this code? We've created a cursor to carry the payload from the select statement, and the payload will be stored inside of the cursor, after which we'll use a for loop using the row variable to maintain whatever value or whatever payload is being extracted from our cursor object. And that is to say, we'll retrieve the employee ID at row 0, the name at row 1, department at row 2, 3, 4, and so on. And before we proceed with any more code, what I'll simply do is maybe just increase the font size so that it is a little more clear. And on the next line over here, I'll simply just print out a statement that says that the operation was successful. After which we want to make sure that we call the connection and call the close method on that connection. Great. So let's run this code and see what we get. So if I run this now, you'll notice I have all the data as it is within our database. We have Jack with an employee ID of number 3, with a salary of 50,000 and a region of UK with the department name executive. Likewise, we have a record for Alexis, Peter, as well as Lois. So if we navigate back to our database user interface, we can see the information is exactly as it is here stored in our database. The only difference is we've retrieved this data inside of our IDE, which can be very useful in the event that we are testing and deploying our database applications. So just to summarize, we've created a payload over here with a SQL statement. That payload gets stored in this cursor. We then use a for loop to iterate through the various rows at a specific index, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 for each employee. We then print that out to the console over here. And that is how we can perform select statements. We can make this a little more interesting. What if we were interested just in one of the employees' records? We can simply tack on a where clause over here, which is a reserved keyword in SQL. And we can say where the EMP, employee ID, is equal to, let's target Lois perhaps. So I'll say equal to 6. And if we run this now, we should only retrieve the record for Lois. That is because we are restricting the data that we are passing through here through the select statement by the employee ID. And we know that only one employee has an ID of 6, which is a primary key in this case. So therefore we can expect only Lois's record to be retrieved. So if we run this now, you'll notice out of all the records, only Lois's record has been retrieved. And that's how we can use the where clause to restrict or filter our data. So what about updating our existing data? Now, to make sense of the update statement, let's use Lois's record as an example. And what we are going to do here is we are going to update Lois's earnings or her salary to 30,000. So I'll erase all the code we have over here up to my import statement. And now I can start writing the code for my update statement. So once again, we first need that connection variable. So I'll say con is equal to my SQLite 3 database dot connect to my employees database. Great. On a new line, I'm simply just going to print that we've opened up the database successfully as such. And then on a new line over here, I'll call that connection dot execute. And now this is the important bit, because now we need to pass in an update operation and not a select operation, because now we are going to update existing data inside of our database. So I'll simply say update the employees table, and I want to set the salary equal to 30,000, where the employee ID, the EMP underscore ID, is equal to 6. Next, we want to commit to this transaction. So I'll simply call the con variable again, dot commit. And this will just make sure that the transaction is written in stone and there is no going back or undoing this transaction. That is what commit means over here. And then I'll print one line of code which will print a string, the number of rows affected by the update, concatenated with the connection variable dot total changes property. And all this does is displays the number of records that were affected by this transaction. The most important thing I would argue in this query over here is the where clause. If we omit the where clause, then SQL is going to update every single employee's salary to 30,000. So if we do not include this part of the query over here, and we only have update employees, set the salary equal to 30,000, SQL is going to assume every single record needs to be updated. However, when we do have the where clause, we can restrict the records that we want to update. And that's basically it. And let's run this code and see what we get. So if I run this now, number of rows affected by the update is 1. Great. And if I head back to my database over here and I refresh this database, we should see the salary increase to 30,000. So what if we wanted to view this inside of Python? What if we did not want to use the DB browser? Well, then we can use the exact same code that we had previously for our select statement, which is this block of code over here, where we have the cursor, the connection, which executes the SQL select statement. And then, of course, we want to close that connection. So if I run this code now, you'll notice that indeed Lewis's salary was increased to 30,000. And that is how we can perform additional operations besides inserts and create using SQL and Python programming. And that brings us to the end of Module 2 in Python programming. In summary, throughout this module, we learned some intermediate concepts in Python programming, such as Lambda functions, exception handling, working with user input, and we even learned how to develop our very own database. In the next module, we are going to focus on more advanced Python programming concepts, and this will ensure that you level up your Python programming skills. Now, with that said, I really hope that you found this course quite enriching and that you found some sort of value throughout the content that we've covered. So I look forward to seeing you all for Module 3. Until then, cheers.